Saving America's historic sites, telling the full American story, building stronger communities, and building the capacity of the preservation field. And we see state historic tax credits being an important part of all those strategic priorities. I would love to see how many people, if you could put in the chat, are familiar with the federal historic tax credit, because that is upon which the state historic tax credits are modeled. So if you're familiar with the federal one, if you could let us know, that would be fantastic. For those of you who might not be as familiar with it, it's a federal program. It offers a 20% credit. The project for rehabilitation must be a certified historic building, certified rehabilitation, and then there is no other type of limitation that the federal government does. If you have done the work appropriately on an appropriately certified historic building, you get your tax credit. And you can see through here that Florida has been a great user of the tax credit. And over 19 years, 234 projects have been done. So that's very impressive. What's even more impressive is that these tax credits actually leverage rehabilitation dollars. So for example, 199 million in federal credits has leveraged over 1.1 billion in the actual rehab activity. So that's exciting. I did want to note that the data that I have is from 2020, and I'll note that there were 3 completed federal historic tax credit projects in 2020. The great thing about the federal historic tax credit, and you can see it listed here, this is a listing that we have on the National Trust website. It shows that it can use for any type of historic structure that's been certified historic. So here you see groceries, apartments, elementary schools, drug companies, jewelries, a store, a theater. So it operates to increase the rehab of any type of structure. And what's also interesting is that the end use, while it must be income producing, can be very creative. People can put new businesses in there. People can put apartments for rent. There are all types of different end uses of a rehabilitated building. And then the scale, I wanted to note that down in Defuniak, which had a tax credit of $84,000 from the federal government in 2019, I wanted to compare that to what was going on in DeLand in 2010, which was a $10 million project to renovate the Athens Theater. So big to small, all types of buildings. So that's a great use of the federal tax credit. In the 1980s, after the federal credit got started, states started looking at how they could also do this type of work themselves. And as of today, there are 39 states that have this type of incentive on the books. And you can see them highlighted in a blue color there, where the states have decided to mimic the federal historic tax credit and offer a state historic tax credit. And what that does is it's like a chemical reaction. My daughter's taking chemistry. It really amps up the power of the federal historic tax credit, which you'll see in a few minutes. My colleague Shaw Sprague and I wrote a booklet about all the different state tax credits in 2018, and you can download it from our webpage there. And there's a lot more information, especially on 3 states. And the one that I'm going to pick on is Texas, because Texas, like Florida, does not tax income. So that makes it unique among all of these 39 states. I also want to point out that states have unique needs and unique problems, and they are using their state tax credits to address certain issues that they want to see addressed. So for example, in California, when they crafted their state tax credit, They were very concerned about closed military bases. They were very concerned about the cost of housing and wanting to increase the amount of affordable housing. So they have a specific type of structure that they used to address their own specific needs. So that is important to know. So I wanted to highlight a place that I'm very familiar with. I grew up near this town. It's actually a Main Street town. And what's unique about Bristol is that the town is divided literally, the state line runs right down Main Street. So on the Virginia side, which has a state historic tax credit, you can see the amount of rehabilitation that's taking place. On the Tennessee side, where they don't have a state tax credit, you can see that the amount of rehabilitation is going on is much less. And what is fascinating about this example is it's the same town, right? It's just that it's bifurcated by Main Street, and one side has a state tax credit and one side doesn't. So you can see on the Virginia side, over the same amount of time, they had 11 rehabilitated buildings with $71.1 million in rehab expenses, and that qualified for the federal historic tax credit. And on the Tennessee side, only 3 projects have been using the federal historic tax credit, and they had 10 million in expenditures. So I just think it's a great example, not only because it's near where I live and a place where I grew up, but it's a really stunning example of the difference that a state tax credit can make. As I mentioned, I'll be focusing a little bit on Texas because Texas is like Florida in many ways. And what's interesting is before they put in place a state historic tax credit, Florida only had 3 completed rehab projects the year before. And for those of you who haven't visited Texas, Texans see themselves sort of as a land apart, and in many ways it is. It's ginormous. And so for them to only have 3 completed rehabilitation projects was quite stunning to see before the impact of a state historic tax credit. And especially since they had more than 3,300 historic places listed on the national register. And you can see on the right, I looked at the 4 years prior to the enactment and then the 4 years after the enactment. And you can see it doubled the amount of rehabilitation that was taking place in the state. Today, there are more than 100 communities that are using the historic tax credit, and most of them are outside of the 4 major cities of San Antonio, Fort Worth, Houston, and Dallas. The Main Street programs have really picked up on this program and are big proponents of the state historic tax credit in Texas. There are 5 common elements that you'll typically see of a state tax credit. This is just sort of the common basics that you'll see. They always have standards that you have to meet. They have the criteria, which buildings are eligible for this credit. They'll have a way to calculate how much of the rehabilitation expenses qualify. They'll require a minimum amount to be invested. And the approval process starts with the State Historic Preservation Office. So that's what is typically common. But as I mentioned, states decide to then target different areas that they want to address. And one of the neatest examples is Colorado. They are using different percentages of credit to try and get the leveraging power of this state tax credit out to rural communities. So their regular credit is 25%. They have 30% if the rehabilitation is disaster related, and they've had a lot of devastating wildfires and other things that they are dealing with in Colorado. But they also started in 2020 increasing the credit for those populations, communities that have populations of 50,000 people or less. And so far, it's having that impact of encouraging rehabilitation across Colorado. Sorry. People wonder why it's important to have a state historic tax credit, and this is my non-math way of explaining it to folks. I am a history major, so, but I am a homeowner. And so when I saw it explained like this in Kentucky, it made sense to me because you're actually borrowing less. So a monthly mortgage payment for a rehabilitation property that you do without any federal historic tax credit would be about $8,000 a month. If you had used the federal rehabilitation tax credit, it lowers the amount that you have to borrow. And so your mortgage payment would be about $6,500. And then if you take advantage of both the state tax credit and the federal tax credit, then you only have a monthly mortgage payment of about $4,800. So it means that you can charge less rent. Let's say you're doing, building commercial rehab, then you can charge less rent and still make your monthly mortgage payment. So I like that example. Another great thing that impresses legislators is that person only gets the state's investment when the work is done. So it's not like you're giving away money. The rehab actually has to be completed before the state's investment is actually made. It also starts to pay back the state's investment during the construction period because of the taxes that are placed on labor and materials. And many different states have studied this payback to the state, and it ranges anywhere from 32 cents, 33 cents, up to 40 cents. So there's a range there of just during the construction period. And then afterwards, it continues to pay back the state's investment through taxes that are placed on the businesses that go, the new businesses that go within these historic buildings. And so different states have quantified this, and depending upon the end use, it's how fast it pays back. So I think you can imagine a hotel with a lot of employees and a lot of activity within that building pay back more quickly than an apartment building with, a couple of maintenance people and a reservation system. Sorry, I keep doing that. So these are the things that, in my mind and in my co-author Shaw Sprague's mind, make a great state tax credit. And what I'm so excited about is that your bills have a lot of these components, right? They're easily transferable, they're predictable. If you do the work, you get the credit. It's tailored to, what your state is considering important, that Main Street support. Mirrors the federal historic tax credit, has percentages to encourage even more rehab in those Main Street communities. And it's available to a tax that your state has so that people can take advantage of it. So the one thing that I would recommend is that there be some fees to support the staff that's going to be doing the work. So if this does go, I would suggest that during that mashing up period in the conference committee that they look at, is there a way to get some support for the staff that would be doing this? And again, I just am very excited about the proposed tax credit for all the reasons listed above. And I want to stop there and say thank you very much, and happy to take any questions that you have at the end of the webinar. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Renee. That was very helpful. And we've got some good questions to get going our Q&A section at the end. So that's great. Richard, you're next. Are you ready?
I am ready. Yeah. Let me share my screen. Hopefully this works. Hopefully you all are seeing that. Once again, thanks for having me here today. I have some similar things to what Renee mentioned, so you'll see me flip through some of my slides quickly where I think we've already covered it. But I, like Renee, am a historian at heart. That's how I was trained. I do have worked with these tax credit programs for the last 15 years. So I guess I would say that I know enough to be dangerous on that tax side. But that's my disclaimer that what I'm sharing with you is my understanding of the program, and that there's some elements that you need to discuss with your tax attorney at some point. But I'm going to take you through quickly just the mechanics of the program. I worked before working on the consultant side, was a reviewer at the South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. So I have seen it from both sides. And I certainly echo what Renee was mentioning about hopefully getting a collection of fee, a modest fee as part of the application process, so that there is an opportunity for there to be some additional staffing to review these projects. I think what we saw in Texas a few years ago was a pretty big bump in the number of projects. And I think there's a potential for that to happen here in Florida. We certainly hope that that's the case. As Renee said, the federal historic tax credit is a 20% credit on what you spend in the rehabilitation of a historic building. It's important to note this is for income producing property for the federal level. That's not for residential work. And the great thing about it, as Renee mentioned, is that it's in scale with what you're producing, right? So a smaller project is going to get a similar benefit, 20% of what you spend. Pretty simple. As we'll talk about, state programs vary quite a bit. It needs to be a substantial rehab. So at the federal level, you need to be investing at least as much as you have invested in the building already in the rehab. So it's not for small projects. The work is certified by the National Park Service, but it makes its way through the State Historic Preservation Office. And an important point to know is that the federal tax credit has a 5-year recapture period or compliance period. So the takeaway from this is that these projects are not supposed to be for flipping properties. You need to keep the ownership intact for a period of 5 years after you do the work. And the Park Service maintains a design review control over the project in that time period as well. What buildings qualify? Renee mentioned certified historic structures. So that is the National Register of Historic Places that's used. Most of the buildings in this country that are on the register are in a district. I'm sure that most of you have dealt with a historic district at one point or another. So there are individually listed buildings or districts. Generally, a property has to be at least 50 years old before it can qualify for listing on the National Register. And in addition to it being that age, it also has to have some sort of architectural or historic significance. If you're doing the calculation, and this is still a little crazy for me, somebody that is approaching the 50-year mark myself, but this means that buildings built before 1972 at this point meet that age requirement. And we're seeing a lot of projects on modern era buildings. So a couple of them here, including one of my favorites, the Griffin Motor Works showroom that we worked on in Florence, South Carolina. It had a NASCAR history to it, which I'm not sure I ever thought I would work with, but there you have it. The federal approval process is a 3-step or 3-part application. Part 1 shows that it's historically significant. It shows that you're in a district or that you could be listed on the National Register. The Part 2 is a design review process with the State Preservation Office. The Division of Historic Resources in Florida is that group. They have had some input in crafting the legislation or the language that we have in the legislature right now. But those folks review the projects, review the plans for what you're planning to do to the building, and they provide a recommendation up to the National Park Service. Part 3 is at the completion of the project. So it's really photo documentation showing that the project was done the way that it was meant to be done and approved. The review time period fluctuates depending on staffing, but by the regulations, it's supposed to be a 30-day review at the state, 30 days at the Park Service, and that typically extends out sometimes quite a bit. And the SHPO and the Park Service are using a set of guidelines and standards that were developed many years ago in the 1970s, the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. And they really are kind of the keepers and the interpreters of those standards. So there are a lot of treatments that have been considered over time, and those are sort of the rules that we play by. The design review takes into account everything on the exterior and the interior of the project. I show a window here because we spend a lot of time talking about window details. For 99% of people that walk by a building, you would not know the difference in a quarter of an inch here or there. But this makes a big difference in retaining the historic significance of a building. And so just one hot button issue, I would say, with the Park Service. On the interior, the Park Service and the SHPO are looking at retaining the historic character of the building. So corridors, any sort of historic fabric typically needs to be retained. A couple of case studies, and I want to try and drive home here a point that Renee made, that there are different types of projects that use the historic tax credit program at the federal level, and that carries on to the state programs. And I also hope in these two examples that I'll illustrate that the tax credits are really an economic development tool for Main Street communities, for downtowns, whether on a small scale or a very large scale, as we'll see. And then we'll also use these examples to talk about how different credits get used, because this is the key to Florida utilizing a historic tax credit program. So this is my first example. This is the Rainwater Building in Florence, South Carolina. It's this 3-story building here. It is a typical commercial building that you'd find in many downtowns throughout the country. A nice storefront that was still intact from the 1950s. This one was put in, and it's located in a National Register district. The building had been vacant since 2000 when our clients purchased this in 2015. It was a local developer. So this is somebody who ran a company, an accounting firm. He's from Florence. He's lived there for the last 10 years before this, and decided to do this project, one, to help his downtown, which had been, many of these historic facades have been covered over with metal and other materials in the 1970s and 80s. The downtown did a very good job, their revitalization group, in taking a lot of those materials off and trying to start to make the case for rehabbing these and getting new uses in. So this was, the developer here was out for the tax incentive, but it was really part of his larger vision for bringing a use into this building and some others. This group had actually already done another project or two, so this was sort of a knock-on project, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. You can see the interior. The upper 2 floors had not been used probably in 40 years as office space. The first floor had been used as for commercial use, but again, it had been 15 years or so since that was the case. And this is the completed project. So this got through the design review process. You can see they retained the storefront, replaced windows that matched historically, and on the interior, tried to maintain these columns, these beams. The original staircase was utilized as well, and rehab. It was used or it is used for a medical accounting firm, again, that the developer was an owner in. So this is a project where the developer themselves had the need for the tax credits, and they were able to use them to offset their income. They spent $2.4 million on the rehab of this building, and that generated for them $480,000 in federal tax credit. South Carolina has a tax credit program, so 25%, they got $600,000 in state tax credit. And then South Carolina actually has an additional tax credit for abandoned buildings. So they were able to get $500,000 in tax credits there as well. The great thing about this project and the great thing about Florence, it's a small city. It's the 5th largest city in South Carolina. And this group, as well as a couple of others, have gone on from this building, I mentioned was the 3rd one that they did, and have rehabilitated about 8 or 10 buildings on the main street in Florence. And this has made a huge change. There's a lot more going on in downtown. Really has done all of the things that the main street communities around the country are trying to do, reinvest in these buildings and towns. So this is a great example of a project where the tax credit was useful directly to that owner, and they were able to apply that to their taxes. How much credit do you get? I talked about 20% of your cost. That really is on anything that's a capital cost in the building. I'll go through these slides quickly. Typically, the things that don't count are the easier things to explain. Any sort of site work outside of the existing building, any sort of new construction is backed out of the tax credit benefit that you get. So this really is encouraging rehabilitation of the historic building that you start with. Now, we say tax credit. I have thrown that out. We've all said tax credits, but what exactly is a credit? And this might be very remedial for some of you, but let's compare what a tax credit is to a deduction. A deduction is something that's taken to reduce your taxable income. And a credit is actually a dollar for dollar reduction in what you owe the state or the federal government. So in this example, if you had $100 of income, you can see a deduction reduces that to $80. It's taxable, and your benefit in the end is a slight reduction in what you owe. As you can see on the credit side, that credit gets applied after the tax is computed. So you wind up, as you can see, owing $15 or 15 cents rather than 28 for a deduction. So this is a much more valuable tool than getting a deduction on your taxes, just to set us all up on the same page here. I think I'll skip by this. This is just a sample budget that shows that certain items that you work on are qualified expenditures for calculating the credit, and certain things are not. Again, site work, furnishings, those things typically don't count. It's important to note that the federal tax credit can only be taken by an owner of the building. So that owner in Florence that we just looked at, no problem. They had a use for the tax credit. They could apply it to their taxes. The credit comes up, as Renee mentioned, when you finish the work, and you're able to apply that sometimes back a year and sometimes in the future. But we'll talk about the ownership piece of this here as we go along. And then there is this recapture period I mentioned before of 5 years, where you need to keep the entity intact, the ownership intact, as well as the work that was completed. So here's a very different example, and I'll go through this quickly. This is the Pizitz department store in Birmingham, Alabama. This was the flagship department store for the Pizitz company. So this was a regional retailer, started in the early 20th century. This is a 1920s building for them. So it wasn't their first store, but it was the flagship. This was, it is listed as part of one of the downtown districts there. And Pizitz closed this location in 1988. So the building has been sitting or had been sitting for quite a long time. This was the state that it was in about 2012. Bayer Properties, who is a local developer, actually developed strip malls really around the country, but they're a Birmingham company. And they purchased this building basically because nobody else would. And they were sort of a big name in town, and they felt like this was something that they should try to take on, even though they hadn't done any sort of historic programs before. They had a tenant that was lined up that was going to take most of this building in 2008, and then we got hit with the housing crisis. The building then sat. Bayer held it for an additional 4 years, and they partnered with a developer out of New Orleans that we work with quite a bit, who's done quite a few historic tax credit developments, Wisnia development. So in 2012, this is what it looked like. And this represents, this takes up about half of a city block on the fringes of what was sort of the revitalizing portion of Birmingham at the time. On the interior, you can see it had some of the original columns, most of the original columns that were left, but also had some kind of 1980s introductions in there. And this is the completed project. Apartments were put in on the upper floors of this building. Around or on the main floor of the building, kind of upscale food hall was created with some retailers underneath this great balcony. The balcony itself was enclosed with glazing and turned into a co-working office space. And this has made a big difference in downtown Birmingham. It is provided a place that everybody goes for lunch downtown, but it's connected that revitalizing piece of downtown to other portions of the grid in Birmingham. So this has been a very successful project, much different scale than the Rainwater building that we saw before. It's a mix of uses, as I mentioned, a portion of those apartments on the upper floor for workforce housing, that particular portion of the workforce. Food hall and retail, co-working office space. They spent $66.5 million in the rehabilitation of this building. That amounts to a $13 million federal tax credit. And this building was actually the reason, or one of the main drivers, for the Alabama state historic tax credit getting passed, because Bayer had been sitting there for so long and seen other states had this type of incentive. They were trying very hard to pass a credit and eventually did. And so this is really the key building, I think, for Alabama having a tax credit program. Interesting story, just the way the Alabama credit works. There is a limited amount that's given out. And in the first year of allocations, this building missed out. So our developers did a lot of work in getting the credit passed, and then actually didn't get the benefit, had to put that off for an additional year. But it made a big difference, obviously. So this is quite different, though, because you've got a developer, and those of you that are developers on the call know that you don't have the tax liability, particularly after you finish rehabilitation of a building like this. You're not going to have the tax to leverage these credits against for years and years. Very few people have $18 million in tax liability. So this is an important point to kind of get into the last piece of what I want to discuss with you. And that's how non-owners of buildings wind up using tax credits. And this is vital for making those larger projects and even some of the smaller projects happen. At the federal level, being an owner of the building is necessary. And so what winds up happening is an ownership entity is created where the developer, the sponsor of the project, is the majority owner of that entity. And an investor who wants the tax credits is a minority owner and takes the use of the credits out of that process called syndication. So this is a way that groups that have a lot of tax liability, like corporations Oil companies invest a lot in these tax credits. Banks, insurance companies invest in historic tax credits quite often around the country. They will pay maybe 80 cents for every dollar of historic tax credit to that developer who has no need for the credit themselves. And it's this process that really allows these larger buildings within the program, and again, some kind of medium and small size buildings, to actually use the tax credits effectively. Some states mimic the federal, where you have to be an owner of the building. So Virginia, it's got a very good program. North Carolina, South Carolina, they all mirror that ownership necessity to syndicate or structure, transfer the credits. But there are some states that have seen that this transfer is necessary and have actually created programs that are called certificated programs, where you literally get a certificate after your project is done. Again, you spent all the money, you get a certificate from the state that has a value of that tax credit. And that certificate can be traded or sold or transferred to another taxpayer. And again, that benefit is in exchange for paying the owner or the developer of the building. So this is what allows Florida and Texas, who's already enacted it, the ability to use a historic tax credit program. The tax credit can be applicable to corporate taxes, insurance premium taxes, licensing fees. So the user, the end user of the credit is going to be larger groups. Could be a high wealth individual, but usually these are corporations that are going to want to pay in or be a part of these projects and provide some financing for the project in exchange for that credit. Renee mentioned this, I just threw this in here. Florida obviously is an incredible state, a lot of great history to it. But one thing that was mentioned was there have been very few, at least in my mind, relatively few tax credit projects in Florida. These are the federal numbers from the last, or from 2016 to 20. And you get a sense if you look at the total rehab cost and what has been spent on historic buildings in the state in this program, that Florida's $86.3 billion in rehabilitation. Connecticut, which has a strong state program, is 8 times that. Arkansas, much smaller state, has a much higher investment in historic properties through this program. So we think that there's a great opportunity in Florida, not only to help with keeping these historic buildings intact, keeping them in use, but also in helping to redevelop and revitalize Main Street communities and urban buildings as well as part of this rehabilitation program. I will stop there. Thanks, and I will pass it along.
Thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to take just a second and let everyone know that Richard and Renee have been working with us along with others from National Trust and other organizations around the country for years, actually, on helping us to get the language for this bill correct and to help us communicate to lawmakers and obviously you guys why this is important will be a great preservation tool. So thank you, Richard and Renee, for your years of helping. And our SHPO's office has also been very supportive of this work, and especially Alyssa Lutang. So really, I think we have had a great coalition of folks to kind of craft this and help push it through. So thank you guys very much. Next, we have Robert, who's just gonna slide right in here.
Perfect. Hey guys, how you doing? Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate that. First time being at her computer, so bear with me here real quick to yeah, I think I got it here. Okay, how do I share the screen?
Okay, all right, I'm gonna hover over you guys.
Let's see.
Yeah, and then
Over here. Okay, so.
You got this.
Okay, there we go. Share. All right, guys, let me go to the presentation here. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks again, Melissa. Appreciate it. And Richard, Renee, thank y'all so much for your presentations. Really made what I'm about to say very, very easy. As you guys know, there can be some technical nuances of these programs, and y'all did a phenomenal job of explaining it. So thank you very much for that. My name is Robert Lay. I'm from New Orleans. I'm with a company called 60 West TCI. We are primarily a tax advantage real estate developer. So we focus a lot on historic rehabilitations, affordable housing, and renewable energy. And then we also are a full service federal and state tax credit syndication firm. So we're able to work with developers to come in and partner with them on the GP side, the equity side, finance debt, structure the federal state credits, and kind of all the capital stack aspects of kind of tax advantage real estate opportunities, and historic rehabilitation is a large part of what we do. So what I'll do today is really kind of expand a little bit on what Renee and Richard talked about, and go through how state tax credits work in a little bit more detail. And we'll focus kind of on what we think, if knock on wood, if we're fortunate that this legislation passes here in Tallahassee, kind of how the Florida credit would work in its kind of certificated posture, as Richard described. Keep in mind, we'll put a big asterisk by this. Legislation, hasn't been passed yet, so things are subject to change, and there will be a rulemaking process. If it does pass, that will further codify and provide some explanation. So I'm going to talk very generally about how it generally would work right now. If you have any questions, we can kind of take how things look in Texas and Missouri and Louisiana, where we have other certificated credits that I think would apply to Florida, to give those here today a sense of what how you would monetize and certificate the state credit. So I will fast forward through the first couple of slides here, just kind of about us, to kind of get onto the state credits. As Renee mentioned, there's about 39 or so states that have a varying form of state credit. Pretty much every state that borders Florida. So Texas, and I know Texas and Louisiana doesn't border Florida, but everything in the Southeast, pretty much short of Florida, has a state credit. As both Renee and Richard mentioned as well, generally speaking, the state credit will piggyback the federal historic credit in a couple of primary ways. Number one, generally the QREs or qualifying costs are kind of the same. And then generally speaking, the requirements in order to earn the credit will generally be the same. So the secretary standards. There's some nuances there and always an exception to the rule, but generally speaking, the two piggyback one another. The two administrative agencies in a state that generally administer the program is the State Historic Preservation Office. I think Renee mentioned that. In this situation, is the Florida Department of Historical Resources here in Florida, and then the State Department of Revenue in Florida will also administer the credit, especially when you come to a certificated credit. And then the interesting thing too about the state credits is, generally speaking, if a project is eligible for the federal credit, it generally will be eligible for the state credit. There are some interesting situations with nonprofits where nonprofits might not necessarily be eligible. A nonprofit owner might not necessarily be eligible outright to take advantage of the federal program, but there are situations where that nonprofit can take advantage of the state program. There's, again, some nuances to that, and that would require further discussion and getting into the weeds, but that is an important distinction to make, especially as it relates to certificated credits. So Richard walked through the federal Part 1, 2, 3 process, and all I'm really going to do is take what he kind of shared with you guys and built the foundation there, and really just kind of show you how the state process mirrors that. And again, we don't know exactly what some of these forms will be called if this legislation were to pass in Florida. So give me a little bit of leeway there, but nonetheless, I think you'll get an idea of how it potentially would work. So out the gate, you need to make sure that the building is eligible for the federal credit, which generally speaking takes place with the federal National Park Service Part 1, the evaluation of significance. Some states will have their own Part 1. Some states will simply just say, if you have a federal Part 1, we're good. You're good to earn the state credit. After the building has been deemed eligible, then you kind of start looking at how are you going to perform the rehab? How are you going to meet the Secretary of Standards to make sure that the rehab on the exterior and the interior will be in accordance with the guidelines in order to earn the credit. That is largely done through the federal Part 2 process, as Richard described, the form called the description, description of the rehabilitation. The states will sometimes have their own state Part 2. It could be called a Part A sometimes, a Part B sometimes, and sometimes they'll just follow the federal Part 2 as well. But you will have, generally speaking, some type of a state Part 2 that and largely is the exact same as the federal Part 2. It's just on a state form that the SHPO will take a look at, so that they can kind of have two parallel paths, a path for the Park Service and then a path for their own resources of, the Park Service path for the federal credit, and then the state Part 2 path, state Part 1, 2, 3 path, if you will, for the state credit. Once the project has been kind of completed and placed in service, 3 and 4, depending on kind of how we're talking about here, 3 and 4, one may come before or after the other, but generally as it relates to state credit process, usually you will have your cost certification done, which is an independent analysis by a third-party CPA that will calculate the QREs. Generally speaking, they'll calculate the QREs for the federal basis and the state basis, which is generally the same number. And then they'll apply the applicable percentage and let you know, okay, you earned X amount of federal credits and X amount of state credits. And then once that independent review has been done, you then generally will take the kind of Part 3 certification process, where you will submit to SHPO, in addition to Park Service, but for state purposes, you'll submit to SHPO for a state equivalent Part 3 or a Part B, or as Richard mentioned, a tax credit certificate. They'll take a look at the project, maybe go on a tour of it or something like that. Generally speaking, it's all done kind of in conjunction at the same time that they're doing a tour of the project. If they do a tour of the project for the federal credits as well, the everything you would send in for the Part 3 a lot of times mimics the same information that you would send in for the federal Part 3 as well. And there will be some type of a way that those credits are certificated. Again, we're talking about a certificated credit in this situation. And again, I'm taking a little bit of liberty here without knowing exactly if this legislation were to pass, how the administration of some of these things is going to happen. And again, that would be codified in the rulemaking process. But basically, the thing that you're looking for the purposes of a certificated credit that is being proposed here in the state of Florida is a tax credit certificate that is issued after the project is completed, after a cost cert has been done, and after the state has been able to kind of validate and say, hey, yeah, you spent X amount of dollars and you've earned X amount of credits, whether it's the 20% credit or the 30% credit, depending on where the project is located. So monetizing the state credit. There's a couple of different structures here. Transferable is the easiest. It's what Florida's proposing. You can get into what's called a disproportionately allocable structure. That's kind of the investor structure that Richard described. The disproportionately allocable structure of South Carolina. There's a pro rata allocation, which is the most difficult. It means you can't really bifurcate the federal and the state credits. New York is an example. And then there's also kind of a refundable, rebatable scenario, which is what Alabama has in current form. Again, Florida is proposing the easiest structure that's similar to what we do in Texas and in Louisiana and Missouri, which is a certificated transferable credit. Richard did a really good job on distinguishing between a deduction and a credit. I'll just take it one step further in saying a state credit offsets a state tax liability dollar for dollar. So if you owe the state of Florida $100 in corporate income tax or the insurance premium tax, and you buy $100 in credits, you don't have to pay the state anything. I mentioned personal income tax on here simply because in states that have certificated credits where they do have a personal income tax, Louisiana, for example, Missouri, for example, the credits would offset the personal income tax as well. In Florida, since there is no personal income tax, the statute as drafted would allow the credits to offset the corporate income tax and the insurance premium tax. Generally speaking, and again, especially in the situation of Florida, where if it's an individual, it's a developer that isn't going to have a state tax liability because there is no, personal income tax in the state, they'll have to figure out, the project can have to figure out how do you monetize these credits. Again, transferable credit here, certificated credit, very easy to syndicate, to monetize. The developer is going to want to use a syndicator or a financier, or if they have relationships with insurance companies or C corps that are paying tax in the state, they can effectively cut a deal, negotiate a deal with that third-party taxpayer to ultimately purchase the credits at some point in time. Generally speaking, the state credit syndication, federal credit syndication, other financial instruments, the loans, bridge loans, construction loans, permanent debt, all that fun stuff. Generally speaking, all that stuff comes together at what we call a financial close, which is right before the start of construction. And at that point in time, the developer generally would say, okay, I know who's going to be purchasing, my state credits. I know what they're going to pay. I know when they're going to pay for them. And all of that is spelled out. And we have these really great pro formas and sources and uses and all that fun stuff that kind of shows, all right, there's enough dollars here to get this project through to completion and also through the compliance period and all that fun stuff. So generally speaking, even though it is a very easy transferable credit, you're probably going to need to know or have a pretty good idea of who you're going to ultimately offload these credits through, transfer them, who's going to purchase them from you at some time before construction. And then kind of the $1 million question is, what are these things worth? And it really depends on a number of factors. It depends on the particular program, it depends on the transaction risk, and it depends on kind of the pay-in schedule and the timing. The number anywhere from the mid 60s to the low 90s is across the entire spectrum. That could be an allocated credit in South Carolina that's earned over 3 or 5 years, all the way up to a single year certificated credit that somebody buys on the open market, in Florida or Texas that, you might fetch, low 90s or something like that. So it really depends on the timing, the risk, and a whole litany of factors. But transferable credits seem to fetch the highest pricing because they are the easiest. And another good thing is they can be purchased after the fact. So for example, in allocated credits, you generally speaking have to be in the partnership prior to the close of the tax year, whereas a certificated credit, let's just say a project in the state of Florida earned a 22 credit, just hypothetically here, and it was certificated and transferable. If it operated like other states, then a taxpayer could purchase that credit sometimes in 23 and claim that on their 22 return, they would then file sometime in 23. So the time value of money, the holding costs that a taxpayer would incur is lower because of that flexibility, and therefore they would be willing to pay a little bit more for those credits. And that's why you see the transferable credits fetching the highest prices generally in the market. Okay, so kind of closing thoughts here on my side of it. The biggest one is ask questions. You've got, I can't tell you how important it is with the Richards of the world and his firm, who do a phenomenal job on historic consultants. They help navigate you through the part 1, part 2, part 3 process. Incredibly important. SHPO is a great resource. The Department of Revenue is a great resource. Do not be afraid to reach out to them and ask questions. Oftentimes they will have information on their website that will spell out kind of, they'll have the FAQs, they'll have, the process, how it works, situations that people have gotten themselves into and kind of examples and all that stuff. And they'll kind of have all those scenarios for you. And the other one is really, and this is a testament to Renee and the trust here with Melissa's, reach out to on the federal level and the state level to the National Trust, the Florida Trust. They are experts and professionals in all things historic preservation and have just tons of experience in this field and can really help you, especially if you're doing something for the first time, really help you navigate some of these nuances. Somebody such as myself and the other panelists here, we kind of get into the weeds, and we've done it a million times. That this just makes sense for us because it's what we know. Somebody who hasn't done this for the first time, it seems very overwhelming, and I totally understand that. So don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out. The resources are definitely there. Another thing that I can't stress enough is just hire competent, experienced transaction partners. Your general contractor needs to have done historic deals in the past, historic buildings in the past. Your architect needs to be very experienced in doing this stuff. can't tell you how important it is for your historic preservation consultant to make sure your part 1s and 2s and 3s are done correctly. Whoever your legal team is to structure the transaction, make sure they're familiar with tax credit transactions and things of that nature. Same thing with your syndicator, whoever's syndicating your federal and state credits, or your financing partner on this federal and state credits, make sure they understand, they know what they're doing. The accountant and tax folks as well, make sure they've done cost search, make sure they understand, how to calculate QREs and identify QREs. There's a handful of very experienced national and regional accounting and tax firms out there that have great expertise in that. And then whoever your lenders are, whether it's bridge lender or construction lending or permanent lending, they need to be familiar with the transaction, because there are some interesting things on the federal side as it gets into federal structures and SNDAs and forbearance non-full foreclosure agreements and all that fun stuff that is different for these transactions as opposed to a normal construction loan or a permanent loan on a new greenfield development that a lender would give, that they need to be comfortable with, because it's a little bit different than what they would normally do. And then the biggest thing is it's just patience. If you haven't done one of these deals before, just be patient, stick with it. It is incredibly rewarding to see some of these old buildings. The pictures that Richard put up, I think, really did a great job of a testament to the before and after, and it's worth it at the end of the day. It really is. But it will, it will test your patience a little bit. It will be a little bit confusing, but use the resources available to you, ask those questions, and try to get those answers as best you can, and kind of get through it. And once you've done it once, then it's a replicatable process going forward. And as many on this call know with developers, once you do one and you get the satisfaction of seeing this old building that's been sitting there vacant for forever and restored to this just what effectively looks like a brand new building set back in the time of whenever it was originally constructed, and you see all the economic development that's going to spur in and around that area, it is absolutely worth it, and very, very satisfying to pull that off. So anyway, that's what I've got.
You guys, Michigan.
All right.
We're getting good at this. All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists who joined us today. So Renee, if you want to share your screen as well. And Mike, our chat moderating guru, you can throw us the first question if you'd like to.
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Awesome. We had a few questions in the chat. The first one, I believe, was for Renee, or was during her talk. She says, Renee said, as long as you do the work right and are qualified historic structures, how exactly does a CLG get their local districts designated certified local historic district?
So I think it depends upon how the state manages the process for getting something listed on the register. I know that there's not, it's my understanding, there's not a separate state register in the state of Florida. So it would be getting it listed on the national register and getting the district. And that's a whole other, program, I think, right, Richard? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Richard.
I think the best answer to that is, if you're not sure if your area is listed on the register, or if you have an interest in getting something listed, the best place is to start with the folks at SHPO in the Division of Historic Resources in Florida. And they can help you figure out whether it's listed, and if not, whether it's sort of a viable candidate for listing the district.
And I actually put in the chat, I don't know if this directly answers the question, but I did put in the chat a link to how I'm kind of breaking down the application process at the state of Florida.
Right. I saw that. It's perfect. Okay. And then we've got another question, I believe, for Renee. Does the National Trust for Historic Preservation have a complete list of federal tax credit projects?
So if you go to the National Trust website, which is savingplaces.org, we have a whole page on the federal historic tax credit. There's a lot of resources about it. And to help advocates who are always working to expand and improve the federal historic tax credit, we take information that's given to us by the National Park Service and create a list. And I put in the chat the list that we created with data up through 2020. And it's my understanding, I don't think we have the data for 2021 yet. So, but that's the latest that we have. And I put the link in the chat so that everybody can go and see what I pulled out was just a section of even one page of the types of tax credits that have been used in Florida. Type of project, sorry.
Perfect. Another question we have that I don't think we've touched on in the chat or much in the conversation so far. What about new construction for ADA facilities that, if installed in a building, would reduce the integrity of historic spaces and finishes?
I think Robert was going to answer this one, so I'm going to try.
Yeah.
I tried to get out of your way and I got in here.
Yeah, so in Richard Day, y'all hop in here too. This is an age-old question, right? And this is where you kind of have some negotiations with the Park Service and the SHPO on the building. You get into fire code issues, ADA issues, and stuff like that. It really is a conversation that it takes place in the Part 2 process, and depending on the way the building is constructed, where you can see where the major exterior elevations are, and what you need to do in order to have that ADA compliance. It's a negotiation with all the parties to achieve that need. Most of the time, I'd say it can be worked out. There are some situations where it becomes a real juggernaut, but it's definitely something that you're going to want to address during the Part 2 process and make sure that everybody signs off on it. Again, you run into the same issue with egress, egress, and fire code and stairs and all kind of crazy stuff like that as well. So it's a very good question.
Yeah, it's really, I agree with everything Robert said. It's a question of whether it's appropriately designed and whether you can make it fit into that part of the program. One thing that we didn't mention that should be mentioned is that these tax credit projects are either approved or denied, the entire thing. So that there's a common misconception that if you do all of the work over here the right way, and there's something that the SHPO and the Park Service don't want you to do, then they'll just reduce the amount of tax credit. And that's not the case. It is an up or down on the entire thing. So the piece that Robert was talking about in the design review process is key, because that typically is deciding whether you get the credit in full or not. And so we tell folks all the time that, typically the SHPO and the Park Service are trying to work out these issues with you and find a way that it will work. But there are sometimes that there are critical items that are difficult to get through.
I don't know if there are any other questions, but I did have a question myself for Mark, if that's appropriate this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Renee.
So you mentioned that folks are getting ready to perhaps be in conference and hoping to get into the Senate side. Is it appropriate for folks at this point to reach out to their state senators and encourage the say thank you to those that voted for it in committee, and then also urge them to be a loud voice in the state legislature with their leaders?
Absolutely. I think on both chambers, both the House and Senate, everyone can reach out to their House and Senate members and say, as we get into the final weeks, please, this bill has passed all of its major committees and is alive to be taken up in conference. So certainly reaching out to the local lawmakers, Senate and House members doesn't hurt. It's going to be kind of left up to the top leadership. If there's anyone on the call here from Chris Sprowls, who's the House Speaker, to Jay Trumbull from Panama City, who is the Appropriations Chair. And then over in the Senate, it's Kelly Stargell from Polk County, who's the Appropriations Chair, and Senate President Simpson. It really is kind of up in their negotiations on what they call the upper level of the chambers. We've done great reaching out to members already, and we have not had one negative vote or even one question in committees. I mean, it just nothing but praise. So I mean, it really is, the legislature seems really excited about it. It's just a matter of trying to negotiate it through these final hoops here.
Yeah, I was going to ask Melissa, is it, I'm not sure the makeup of everybody that's on this, but would it be helpful for us to talk about kind of the important talking points and kind of
Yep.
issues or keys to the legislation?
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, and something I was going to mention. And just a quick additional point, Mike has put in the chat a link to our most recent blog that kind of talks about the House committee panel that we just went through. And there's a link there that tells you sort of all the different committees that we've gone through, that shows all of the representatives and senators who were on those individual committees. So Renee, to your point, I think reaching out and saying thank you, just staying engaged. All of us, I think, have worked for years to move the needle forward in terms of understanding what historic preservation is among this audience. So I think we've come a long way from where we started, for sure. I don't know if we got a question on this, but we are also still advocating for the Florida Historic Preservation grants as well. That's another thing that we're working on getting funding for. But okay, so Richard, you know what we'll do is we'll put our talking points in the chat so everyone has that.
The one sheet.
Yeah, the one sheet talking points. Did you have some ideas as to some good talking points that you want to share?
Yeah, I jotted down a couple that I think are important for folks to note. I think Renee did a really good job of talking about how far a tax credit dollar goes in additional revitalization. So that a lot of the discussion in trying to pass these state programs is what does it cost the state versus what you get out of it. And so I think making sure that, and Renee, I can't remember what that multiplier is, but I think it's for every dollar, it's something like three additional tax dollars are leveraged from that work. I think that's key, and that's a starting point to talking about the program. I think a couple other key things are to note that, as I think all of us, Robert, Renee, myself, have tried to mention, there's an existing process that's in place, right? The State Historic Preservation Office does a great job in reviewing these applications. What we're talking about setting up really follows the same process. So there's not in my mind, there's not a huge additional infrastructure that needs to be put in to take care of these applications. I do think, as Renee mentioned as well, that there may be a flood of these projects to come through. So it would be good to maybe capture a modest fee so that there can be some additional administration hiring at the SHPO to the extent that's possible. And then I think the other two things to try to make sure get maintained through this legislative process as far as pieces of the bill, transferability of it is an absolute necessity, right? For a state like Florida, it's not going to get used if the person that owns the building has to use it on their own taxes, right? Because then it has to be a corporate entity that's doing it kind of out of the goodness of their heart, and that it doesn't work as often. And then the other piece I think is that what often comes up is legislators trying to limit the amount of tax credit that's given out across the state. So we have quite a few states where there's a cap across the state. There's $20 million, $50 million in tax credits for the bigger states. And the issue with creating a capped program is that you then do have to set up a whole system of who gets the tax credits each year. And so you wind up creating either a political process to decide who gets it, or you wind up unsure as a developer whether you're going to get a tax credit when you're committing to a project. And so I think that's another key piece, is that having a program that says you spend the money and you get this percentage of tax credit back. That's a key to people doing these projects, is knowing that that's intact and that they're actually getting the credit that's in that percentage. So those are my soapbox issues and things that I think are important for folks to talk to legislators about as this goes forward.
Renee, do you have anything? I think that's a great list. Do you have anything you would like to add to that, Renee?
Yeah, I think that in terms of talking points, that a lot of people don't undertake these rehabs without a state tax credit. They need that to fill the financing gap. And I think I was just reviewing before I came on, it's like 82% of folks using the credit in Ohio said they would never have undertaken the rehab if it hadn't been for the state historic tax credit. So people just won't do the work unless it's incentivized by the state. And that the other thing for state legislators, I think is particularly important is, you know, the money doesn't go out the door, doesn't leave the state coffers unless the work is certified. And that the State Historic Preservation Office is happy and that the work has been completed. So,
And the money already spent on the
and the
part of
money
the
already spent, the
developer, right.
private dollars already spent. So yeah, it's a very, it's not like one of the other tax credits where it's a promise. This is, the work's done. So.
That makes perfect sense. And I would just add to that, that with the legislation that's currently being reviewed, the start date for the tax credit would be January 1st, 2023. So that would be when these would be available. And that, just to clarify, the state tax credit would marry with the federal historic tax credit. So that would be a great value, obviously, to rehabilitating the structures, but it also helps for the SHPO staff who are going to be actually undertaking to do the work. So that was sort of the most efficient and effective way that we could think to sort of sell it to the legislative folks and to make it kind of palatable for the folks at SHPO. They're gonna have to be doing it. Robert, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, and you know, to Renee, I think you did a great job in showing the value of the state credit with your Texas slide. You know, only 3 deals got done the year prior. And then after that, it was just a huge boom. I mean, there's just no doubt that you need that little additional incentive in order to make these deals work. And the one thing that you see time and time again, you know, because the Secretary's standards are strict, and they're strict for a reason, it often costs, you know, more to preserve a historic structure than it does to tear it down and rebuild. And so you have to have these incentives to preserve these structures and the building materials and all the beautiful things that make these buildings historic. And that being said, the one thing that I would add too is historic rehabilitation is really the most sustainable way, to build, right? The existing infrastructure is there, the roads are there, the sewer, water, electric, plumbing, gas, everything is there already. The building structure is there already. You're not building all new infrastructure. You're simply rehabbing what is there. And that's really important going forward, as we have to really take into consideration, you know, when we build new, what is the infrastructure going to cost? And that's one thing that cities and states and municipalities don't really have to incur when we do historic rehabilitations and adaptive reuses, right? And that's a big cost that policymakers have to think about when considering this legislation, because it definitely is way cheaper to do urban infill and historic rehabs and build out all the infrastructure associated with new construction.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely great point. Mike, how are we looking on the questions front here?
Well, I know we're fast approaching 1 o'clock, but we did have a couple of questions come in just a few minutes ago, and I'm wondering if we have time for a lightning round of a few more questions here.
Well, save me. I have something I would like to share real quick, and then I'll get it out of the way. Then we can do the lightning round of questions. But Renee and I also have worked together for many years to advocate for legislative funding at the federal level for the federal historic tax credit and the historic preservation fund. And I just wanted to mention, and I'll put a link in the chat, but the Preservation Advocacy Week, which used to be in person, if you remember, Renee, when we'd actually walk the halls, it will be virtual this year. And I would love for as many people as are interested and able to be a part of that and learn a lot about the federal historic tax credit and the historic preservation fund and the advocacy work that's happening at the federal level to make historic preservation happen here in Florida. So it's March 7th through 10th, and I'll put the link in the chat. And then also the Florida Trust is the statewide coordinator for the legislative office visits that we do. And those will be virtual this year. So anyone who would like to be a part of these conversations with lawmakers and staff that can just help demonstrate the story of the importance of historic preservation and the economic vitality that is created through historic preservation, we'd love to have you on the team. So just take a look in the chat, please, for that link. And then Mike, we can do, oh, and I'm seeing people are registered and doing it in Louisiana, so that's great. So we can do the lightning round now, Mike. Thank you.
That's perfect. All right, I'll run through a couple questions. We've touched on this a little bit, but if approved or passed, how soon can people start applying and working on their projects, or what kind of timeline can we expect for this?
And while it's going into effect in January, I'd imagine if it passes in the next couple of weeks, that the Department of Revenue and Department of State will be charged with promulgating rules over the summer, and we'll know a better schedule of how it goes through. But it won't take effect until the 1st of January, but we'll know how to engage, or folks will know how to engage the tax credit probably by fall, if we pass in the next 14 days, the legislation.
One thing I'll add there, Mark, is I think that the rules and regulations process is going to dictate, if a project is in process right now, whether that January 1st date is something where it's when you finish a project or where you apply. But
I think the legislation was written, I need to confirm, but I think it won't, if you're already midstream. Well, I'm sorry, no, with the Fed, if you're applying for the federal currently, I think you'll be able to apply for the state. It doesn't take place until after the first of the year.
I can't remember if it was placed in service date or part 1, 2, 3 application date.
Right, I can confirm that.
So I think what we're hearing is if it is passed, we will absolutely, as the Florida Trust, stay on top of this and determine through the rules process some of these tactical, tangible next steps that we just don't know yet, but certainly need to. But we could commit to you guys that we'll be the resource to help share that information as it gets hashed out.
That's great. And then tying into that, we were asked earlier, what do we think is our gut feeling of the chances of this passing? Anyone want to make a statement on that?
I know Mark and Robert have.
I will say, as an observer of the legislature for a long time, it's kind of 50-50. There's an appetite for it. I don't know anyone that's opposed or negative to it. Even when we had the economic forecasters last week met and determined that it might have around a $50 million impact in its first year. No one seemed to really think that that was outrageous, or at least none of our sponsors, or didn't hear anyone balking at it. It's just a matter of we will be part of a negotiation, and it may not be tax credit versus tax credit. It may be you pass this pro-life bill and we'll pass your tax credit, and these a couple other things. So I say 50-50. I think we will have a really good idea. I know we will know probably this time next week or next Friday, because I just saw a little notice that the leaders of both chambers said go home for the weekend, but come back on Monday and prepare that we're going to have conference until we're done next week. So we should have known if we're in it or not by the end of the week.
one thing to note, maybe Renee, you could chime in here too, but these tax credits at the federal level and in states really play well on both sides of the aisle. And so I think what I'm hearing from Mark is that, a lot of times the key is how many people hear from, right? So now is the time to connect to your legislator and make sure, a lot of times it's about the number of people that contact and show an interest in it. So I think that probably makes a difference. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Absolutely. And we are kind of blessed with two great sponsors. The Senate sponsor, I didn't know that well. I kind of knew her through the years, but I mean, both of them have been working their chambers pretty well too, working their members, each committee and now on the floor, because currently they're going to be on the floor in both chambers every day, day in and day out. And so they're just bugging the chairmans that in the leaders of the chambers to try and get ourselves in the package.
Renee, what would you say?
I was going to say, it's the same thing with my kids, that the squeaky wheel gets taken care of. So I have one that, is very loud, and I try and take care of that one. So I think loud is good. Loud at this time is good. So
the other thing I'll say is that, these are great projects to show. right? If you're talking about what's a worthwhile investment for the state, you can debate about that, but showing an old historic building that's vacant, no windows in it versus what it is at the end of the day, an economic generator, great looking building, a piece of Florida history. These play well from a marketing standpoint.
And one other talking point is that they're back on the tax rolls. I mean, most of them are vacant and abandoned. And so that increased tax benefit to the town it supports so many things. So having local mayors is really important as well. Chime in.
I'm very hopeful. And I have gotten commitments from both sponsors, barring any trouble with re-elections, that they'd be more than willing to do it next year. But like Senator Rodriguez, I was just telling Robert before we got on, she told me the other day, she's like, you got me next year, I'll do it. But she's like, I'm not giving up this year, and you guys, keep working it. So that's what we're doing.
So just as a reminder for everyone, I think that's a great comment, Renee, about the squeaky wheel, and we can all make some noise. So it is House Bill 247 and Senate Bill 1310. And if you go to floridatrust.org, there's just some blogs that have kept us sort of informed on where we are in the process and what committees we've been to and what's next. And it says the folks on those committees, if you want to reach out.
And the link to find your senator and house
Yes.
member,
Yes.
your specific senator and house member. But you don't have to just hold out for yours, bug everybody in the area, adjacent house members and Senate members. Like I said, it can't hurt to try and, get the messages. I know they're getting pummeled with a bunch of them in the final days here, but it's not bad to be a part of it.
Absolutely. So it is 1 p.m. and I want to be mindful of our participants and our panelists' time. So thank you again to our panelists for being a part of this. It was fun. And we will send an email with the folks who registered and just share some follow-up information. I'm sorry we didn't get time to go over all the questions, but I'm happy to answer them. And we can certainly get those to our panelists to answer as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.